utopian thinking because, you know, a civil war was fought
right.
when the Southerners broke away from the Union. But that, you know, never happened. So he was pushing a philosophy of reparation for the pain and suffering of slavery, separation from whites because they didn't want to integrate, and then self-determination, economic self-determination. So he was more or less embraced Booker T. Washington's economic agenda. When Martin Luther King came along, the dominant civil rights movement was the NAACP. And of course, A. Philip Randolph with the labor movement, the Pullman Car Porters. And so you had a labor agenda with A. Philip Randolph, and then you had Rel Wilkins with the NAACP. But their battle was mainly in the courts. It was when Martin Luther King came along that the fight was actually taken to the streets. And they embraced the philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi. So King's philosophy was that Christ provided the spirit in terms of a Christian liberation theology, and Gandhi provided the method. So now you have Christian Gandhian concept inside America, and then you also have the dialectics of the Islamic nationalists. So that's the real clash between Malcolm and Martin. And that's
in a real sense, I think, excuse me, in a real sense, I think that this sort of will lead us into the last segment of this particular show, and then you're going to get into an individual or individuals that will bring us in a different situation, and et cetera, I would imagine.
Yeah, I want to talk about how ultimately they were on the same page in the finishing session.
Very good.
Because,
and of course, let us take this second commercial break, and we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to the third segment of the show for the morning. We're talking to Dr. Al-Hadid, formerly from Tennessee State University, and a professor dealing with just a whole variety of information dealing with the African experience in the United States. And of course, Doctor, let us see if we can pick up where we left off during this second segment, and to have you to talk about for the next 10 minutes, 8 to 10 minutes, some of the things that come out of the great debates, and, and to sort of finish that out for us.
Yeah, you know, we talk about the great debate as a dialectical project. We usually present Dr. King as the thesis of integration, and Malcolm or El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz as the antithesis. So that's where your conflict come in. And so what I want to do now is to thrash out a synthesis of that thesis and antithesis. So when we try to synthesize King and Malcolm, we have to understand that the zeitgeist, or the spirit of the time, some call it the forces of history. You know, history is animated by a spirit, and those events and dates and so forth are animated by a spirit. And this zeitgeist, or the spirit of the times, had tracked both Malcolm and Martin down. They were great men, and they were inspired great men. They had taken vows of poverty. They didn't have life insurance. They were totally committed to the movement because there was a cause bigger than themselves. And I think the mountaintop experience for both men, when Martin Luther King went to Oslo, Norway in 1964, December of 64, where he received the Nobel Peace Prize. And then, of course, he made a pilgrimage to India. So this gave him a global view. Now, with Malcolm in 64, he had a similar experience. In April of 64, he made the pilgrimage to Mecca. Then he traveled extensively throughout Africa and the Middle East. So Malcolm's pilgrimage to Mecca and his travels throughout Africa, and then King's Nobel Peace Prize and his travel in India. And he also made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, where he made his Christian pilgrimage. So by both of them going outside of America and looking at our problem, that is the problem, African American, as a global problem, they both moved to the position of human rights. So King shifted from an exclusive focus on human rights to a focus on, on civil rights to a focus on human rights. Malcolm shifted from a focus on separation to a focus on human rights. So I think toward the end, in the 60s, Malcolm was assassinated February 21st, 1965, but in 64, they both agreed on the question of human rights. Malcolm's project in the last days was to go to the newly free African countries and try to get those heads of states to join him in a coalition of conscience to bring the United States government before the World Court accusing it of genocide. So he wanted to file a petition to the United Nations. It wasn't anything new because Paul Robeson had done that. Marcus Garvey attempted to bring a petition to the World Court in the United Nations. But here again, the focus is on human rights. So then when you look at Martin, in 64, two things have happened for Martin. One is he's completed the Montgomery campaign and got a victory there in 55, 56. And then, of course, the 1964 Civil Rights Act has been passed. That was his campaign in Birmingham. So at this point, he's moving now toward his Selma campaign, which was in 65, in the spring of 1965. But here again, you see him moving toward going from protests to politics in terms of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You also see him moving toward the dialectics between labor and capital. And that's what ultimately the movement in Memphis was all about with the sanitation workers. This was
That's what got him assassinated.
That's what got him taken off the stage, you know, with that issue. And of course, Malcolm got taken off because of his efforts to bring charges of genocide against the United States government. King also was looking at the triple evils of racism, war, because he ultimately took a position against the war in Vietnam in April of 67. He was assassinated in April of 68. And then also the issue of poverty. So he was trying to meet Johnson halfway because, you know, Johnson had this war on poverty and the anti-poverty program. So that was his connection with Johnson in terms of dealing with the question of poverty. So in this case, you're seeing both of them dealing with the human rights issue. Another thing that you're starting to see now is that both of them became internationalists, not simply because King had the Nobel Peace Prize or because Malcolm made the pilgrimage to Mecca, but because they're starting to see international solutions as a way of solving the problem of African Americans out of the United States. So what they were both saying is that the problem at that time, there were 22 million African Americans, said this problem is not just a local, regional, or domestic or national problem. This is a global problem. So wherever people of color are on the world stage today, they're having the same problems, dealing with poverty, dealing with colonization outside of Africa and segregation inside of America, and then also dealing with the question of war, because this whole war machine, the military-industrial complex, was impacting the whole of the global economy, not just African Americans who were fighting that war, or Americans who were fighting that war, all over the planet. You know, you had this, at that time you're dealing with the Cold War. You had Russia and China lined up against the United States, England, France, and so forth. This is the aftermath of the Second World War. So they were both trying to understand the struggle within the context of the Cold War. Prior to this, you know, you had the Bandung Conference in 1954, where the newly independent African heads of states and Asian heads of state met in Jakarta, Indonesia. And they were looking at a third world strategy, a third world solution to the problems that they were having in Asia, the problem they were having in Africa. And as Malcolm pointed out in his message, his grassroots speech, the only people that were not allowed to come to the Bandung Conference was the white man, people from Europe, because they were the former colonial masters, and inside of the United States, you know, was a slave master. So I think in that context, King and Malcolm were coming together. Now, in terms of the dialogue itself, there were two attempts. One is when King and Malcolm met in the Congress in 1964 when they were debating the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It was just like a Kodak moment or a cameo. They didn't really talk much because they didn't have time, but there's a picture where they came together and they greeted each other, and I think at that point they both realized, when you see it in that picture, they both knew that they were marked men, that they had made a choice in life that was irreversible, and if they kept going down that path, then they were going to become martyrs. I think they both realized it when they came together at that point.
Not only, excuse me, did they realize that,
Yes.
but I think the entire American, especially the entire Black American
Yes.
culture,
Yes.
understood
Yes.
that what was the only thing that
Right.
could come out of what they were saying
Right.
would be their deaths.
Right.
Yeah, I think that was quite that was understood, and that even though they were tragic events, both deaths, that all of us probably said they were not surprised. Why? Because everything was sort of leading that way. They were
Right.
the martyrs
Yes.
of the cause in
Yes.
a real sense.
Yes, and then with King coming to that realization, he started. You notice some of his speeches. In fact, one time he actually gave his eulogy at one point. But then he would, when you hear him in Memphis when he's saying, I've been to the mountaintop and I've looked over. I might not live to see the promised land with you, but I know that we of the people will make it to the promised land. And so I see that in the sense of, throughout King's career, he was more or less a Christ archetype. He followed, the path of Christ. But toward the end, he became more like Moses. Because this is Moses now, who's on Mount Sinai to get the Ten Commandments, looking across the Jordan River and seeing Canaan.
He had, in reality, reached that point as far as his international reputation was concerned. I think you indicated the World Peace Prize and all of that. Everybody believed him to be, in a real sense, that individual.
Right. And Malcolm would always say, people would ask him, "Are you afraid for your life?" He said, "I'm already a dead man. I live every day like I'm a dead man."
Okay.
And he said the price of freedom is death.
Let me thank you, Dr. Al-Hadid, for bringing by that excellent information. And let me encourage our audience to tune in again next week for another informative edition of Comments. Thank you and good morning. Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is Dr. Martin L. King and the beloved community. And we're fortunate to have with us to talk about Dr. King and the beloved community, Dr. Lewis Baldwin, formerly of Vanderbilt University and now a person that has so much information, has written so many books, and has a lot of information for the entire community. And Dr. Baldwin, let me thank you, first of all, for coming by and being with us.